Okay, good afternoon. My name is Fred Birnbaum. I'm with the Idaho Freedom Foundation. I guess we're the last panel, the tail end today. It's probably appropriate that you do budget and taxes last. But in any case, I would be pleased to introduce the panel that we have. To my immediate right is Senator Andy Biggs of Arizona. And next to him is Steve Buckstein of the Cascade Policy Institute, just down the road, and Bob Williams of State Budget Solutions. I'm going to ask each of them to speak for a few minutes, then I've got about 4 questions, and we'll turn it over to the audience.
Well, with both issues, whether it's budgeting or pension reform, Arizona has the good fortune of having an ongoing cash revenue of an increase of probably $325, $350 million this year above what was projected. So with us, you end up having to manage expectations because so many people believe that you need to immediately go ahead and make adjustments upward in spending to get to those levels that you were. So managing expectations is part of budgeting, as well as trying to dictate the narrative. And largely what I've heard today from every other panel that's been up here has been the notion of how sometimes the left drives the narrative. We need to turn that around ourselves and drive the narrative with regard to budgeting as well, because what is it that we are constantly labeled as doing? We're either trying to kill people by removing them from health, state welfare health programs, or we're trying to produce the stupidest kids in the world with our failure to fully fund education to whatever level somebody thinks is appropriate. We need to drive budgeting by talking about people, by talking about policies, as opposed to necessarily the amount of money that is spent on a certain thing. And how long did you want me to just take in? Just a few minutes? Well, you get a politician with a microphone. An hour is just a few minutes for me. So as we manage expectations and we try to dictate the narratives, we need to specifically make sure that we remind people of what we've said in the past. For instance, Arizona, we have a cash carry forward. That's why I call it a cash carry forward. I never use the word surplus, because at the same time we have a cash carry forward, we actually have a structural deficit in excess of $500 million. We don't even own our state capital. We mortgaged all of our state buildings by $1 billion. In fact, just a year ago, we were concerned about whether how we were going to pay for state government, and someone said, hey, we still have $400 million available to borrow against state buildings. So we've got to really manage the expectations. You have to dictate the narrative, and then I'm looking forward to a further discussion about different budgeted and pension issues. I got to get to this before I forget. With regard to pension issues, we have a unique thing right now going on in Arizona where we actually have the head of the firefighters union has come to the state, and we've been sitting down for the last 4 months negotiating pension reform. It's my understanding that in fact, I know this guy is taking a beating from national fire unions. But as we look at this, within Arizona, within our public safety pension system, we are ranked the 6th worst funded pension system in the country. We're teetering on the edge where the experts tell me that it's almost unsolvable. So with regard to that, I wanted to just point out one police agency that we have in our state where the employer contribution rate is 105%. That's 105% of salary. So for an employee making $100,000, not only do we pay the $100,000, not only are we paying the health and other benefits, for their retirement contribution, it's $105,000. This is actually what I like to say unsustainable. And so we see motivation within the fire unions, within the police unions, and with the state government now to try to reform, as we see actually 3 cities in Arizona teetering There's an election coming up here in a couple weeks in one of our cities to raise taxes just to pay for the pension employer contribution rate. I'm curious to see what the citizens of that municipality do. But anyways, we have to deal with these situations, and I'm grateful to be here with you today.
Yeah, I'm Steve Buckstein. I founded Cascade Policy Institute, which is Oregon's free market think tank, just down the road from Washington State. And I'm not going to get into a lot of detail about our tax and budget situation because every state is different. We did have an increase in revenue and the budget went up this year, although we're facing, I believe it's something like a $6 billion deficit in the next few years because of rising unfunded pension liabilities and Medicaid costs, which the federal government promised to pay for a while, and now Oregonians are going to be picking up the tab. But I wanted to talk about a more, I guess, systemic thing for state legislators. I was asked several years ago to talk to a group of local government officials in Oregon about whether they should be looking to run their local governments like a business. And I hear that from some legislators too, that if we only ran government like a business, everything would be fine. And I thought about it, and my conclusion was that you shouldn't be looking to run your government like a business because the goals are different. For any of you that have started a business or run a business, you're trying to maximize revenue, you're trying to maximize your profit. Government shouldn't be trying to maximize revenue, it should be trying to maximize liberty, individual and personal economic liberty. And those are two very different things. And then as I listened to Andrew Coulson in the keynote address at lunch, talking about how one of the reasons that education has not innovated is that people have a very negative attitude, and apparently have for centuries, about the profit motive in education. And I thought about that also, and one of the co-authors of the book, some of you may remember it, Reinventing Government, was in Portland a number of years ago, talking to a group of government officials. And he was trying to tell them that one way to reinvent government is to become more efficient, like the private sector, which is a profit-making organization. And he said if you become more efficient, like the profit makers, then you can, quote-unquote, extract more revenue from your taxpayers. That sort of struck me wrong. But the next point he said was that the reason government can do things more cheaply is that it doesn't have to earn a profit. And those are incompatible. Which is it? Does profit drive innovation and lower costs, or does profit basically make things more expensive? I don't think he saw the irony of that. In my view, what we need to do is understand that the profit motive is good. That in the private sector, the profit motive is the reason people jump into new opportunities, meet human needs, because there's an opportunity to make a profit. And the more people in or out of government that demonize the profit motive, the harder it's going to be for government or anybody else to meet their needs, because things aren't going to get done. So I think passed out, if not, there's some up here, can government be run like a business? And it basically is looking at these concepts, and I think it's good for people in government, in this case state governments, to think about that and not try to run like a business, not try to maximize your profit or your revenue, but try to maximize liberty. And in today's climate, I think in all climates throughout history, the way you maximize liberty is to reduce the size and scope and power of government wherever possible, not increase it.
I'm Bob Williams. I was the founder of the Freedom Foundation, Washington State. The last 4 years, I've been running State Budget Solutions. We're a Federalism in Action portion, which works with Ken Ivory's group. We also go anywhere where there's willing legislators or willing governors to work on pension reform or budget reform. Many years ago, back in the 60s, I was an auditor for the U.S. Government Accountability Office in Washington, D.C. I had interesting audit assignments, the Pentagon and the Post Office. Nothing in that experience prepared me to become a state legislator and be on the budget committee. I was amazed at the lack of accountability for state budgets. And in most of your states, you still use an old archaic budget system where you take the current budget, add caseload increases, add an inflation factor, add a couple new programs, and that's the base budget. There's precious little attention called outcome measures. Now let me give you a wake-up call on this Friday afternoon. The GAO puts out our annual report. The January report from the US GAO says, the fiscal gap in state and local governments will require action to be taken today that's this year, and maintained every year until 2058. That's 2058, equivalent to an 18% reduction in current spending or a corresponding increase in revenue or a combination of both. Now, why is that? It's because of the economic forecast, it's because of healthcare, it's because of Medicaid, it's because of pensions, and it's because of OPEB. Those factors. What we've been urging at State Budget Solutions is states to go into outcome-based budgeting. And one of the things that we've tried, and Washington State did a great job of it when they had a deficit, but then they had a surplus and they threw it out. And that is to actually come up with core functions of government. Have 5 to 10 core functions of government. And then every item in your budget has to meet one of those core functions. What a radical idea. And the neat thing is if you have a liberal governor and he has 10 core functions of government and you disagree with 4, but every program's tied to that, when you get a conservative governor, you can wipe out the programs immediately because they're all linked to that. And then have every agency have measurable outcome goals and objectives. And that is really an interesting thing to do. Then be sure to look at all funds budget. I know I'm so close to still Washington State, many Washington State legislators still only look at the general fund state budget. They don't look at the all funds budget. And one of the things we're urging all the states to do is do as Utah did, Financial Ready Utah. Look at all funds. I was talking to a Mississippi legislator a couple of days ago at NCSL, and I said, do you realize that 49% of your total revenue comes from the federal government? He said, no, I wasn't aware of that. We're not aware of how much comes from the federal government. Utah did that, and they have a contingency plan for a 5% reduction, 25% reduction in federal funds. But the more important thing is have your agencies tell you, the legislature, what the maintenance of effort requirement is and how much that's costing them. I would say if you really did that in education, you wouldn't take any federal money. If you look at how much money Race to the Top, No Child Left Behind is costing you in terms of compliance, you wouldn't take any federal money on education at all in terms of that. And then pensions. Again, a big secret in state is the pension assumptions that are being made. Whether it's the life expectancy, a couple years ago, Washington State had a budget shortfall. So they decided, didn't tell the legislators, that one of the things we'll do is assume people will work for the state longer, and then when they retire, they'll die in the first year. Well, that does reduce the amount you have to put into pensions, but it's not realistic. Now they have another deficit in terms of that. The other thing is to really take a look in your states at higher education faculty. Why is it you're not hearing from higher education faculty on pensions? Because they have a great system. In most states, they have a defined contribution system. In most states, it's TIA-CREF. It's a system where they're in charge. They get annual reports. They would know in a given year if the higher education university did not fund them. They would know in a year if there was any problem with the system. It's portable. They can transfer from one university to another university. They get annual transparency on their program. Why is it we can't sell that to K-12? I know it's because of the NEA and AFT, but did you know if you get the NEA or AFT to oppose it, get a copy of their IRS report, their 990, and you will see that the AFT and the NEA have a defined contribution model for the headquarters employees. And when I questioned them at a NCSL session a few years ago, they said, well, that's a voluntary program. Well, let's make it voluntary for our K-12 teachers. But in many of your states, a K-12 teacher has to work 6 to 10 years to be vested in the pension system. Why not put them in a defined contribution system immediately in terms of that? And then your OPEB, your retiree health care. Now, you're going to have to start reporting that on your financial statements, and that's another interesting factor to look at. But outcome measures, a lot of your states are doing it on higher ed now. They're starting to do it in higher ed. They should be doing it on everything. If you want to save money in your states, look at outcome measures for K-12, higher education, and corrections, and I guarantee you'll save hundreds of millions of dollars.
Thank you. I'd like to start off with a question where I'm going to ask for as much specificity as possible. And that is, how should state lawmakers propose spending limits to ensure that revenue increases don't simply lead to higher levels of baseline spending? So what sort of specific measures, as opposed to sort of a general inclination, would each of you recommend?
Well, I'm going to dwell on process, if I can.
Sure.
And And one of the ways that I think you can do that is you initiate the process early, and you initiate the process in a very. This is what I get criticized for in Arizona: is you initiate the process in a very constrained fashion, so that you are addressing specifically the spending, not by the formula growth, not by anything other, which we seem to be locked into constantly as the formula growth, but you're addressing the spending with the idea of what you believe the real revenue is going to be. And you take in my opinion, you take an ultra-conservative revenue forecast. And so you lock in there, so you have to have revenue forecast, you have that. And then I like the other aspect with it, which is what is the objective and what are we seeing come out. So when I take a look at that, I keep those who are working on the budget in a very tight group, because the bigger your group is, and it will get big enough soon enough, if I can just be honest. You start off tight so you can constrain it as much as you can process-wise, because as soon as you open it up, then you're dealing with the stuff that doesn't make sense, where somebody's coming in and wanting to be very transactional about the budget. So when we start talking about, and you guys can talk about some other specifics perhaps, but for me, I look at it from process, and the way you get the process is you've got to control it, and you've got to be tight, and it's got to be tight as long as possible, and you have to have the executive buy-in, because when you don't have the executive buy-in, it doesn't matter how tight that is from the legislature. But once those two things are together, the executive plus the tight group that you have, then you open it up to the rest of the legislature. You have the capacity to constrain the spending growth, even though revenue may have increased or may be projected to be increased. Because why? You've identified what we have in Arizona, which are massive liabilities, and you've constrained the possibility of growth by constraining those who are participating. To me, that's a process-driven exercise, and not necessarily a theoretical exercise or an actual application of what an agency does. It's controlling the process, and that's what I try to do, and that's what I've tried to do even when I wasn't in leadership. When I was just a regular member, was to try to, I would just show up at leadership meetings. Vince, I'm telling you this, don't do this in Arizona, but I used to just pop in at budget leadership meetings and just go and sit there. And the first time I did it I was a freshman, had not been sworn in yet, and the Senate president, I was a state rep, and I'm just sitting there. The Senate president didn't know me from Adam. He thought I was a staffer, I guess, because he never even asked why I was there, and I'm just taking notes. But I think process constraints, more than anything else, constrains the growth in spending. It keeps it real.
Well, I won't talk about process since I'm not in a legislature. I just testify in front of Oregon's legislature. Personally, I would like to see some kind, not something to control the growth of state spending, but something to reduce state spending. One of the ways, as Bob and I have talked about, is getting government out of the things it shouldn't be in. Our founding fathers talked about protecting life, liberty, and property, not providing our entertainment, our alcohol, our jobs. We have the Liquor Control Commission in Oregon. We have the Oregon State Lottery. You probably have something similar. We spend a lot of money on quote-unquote economic development, which is not a government function from my standpoint. So I would like to see government getting out of those things, which I think would do more to restrain or reduce the growth of government. On the last or next to last day of our legislative session last month, I was shocked to hear a state legislator talk about how public sector investment leads to private sector investment. And obviously we need infrastructure, but in his mind, you couldn't spend enough in the government. Every dollar you spend in the government led to more spending in the private sector, not realizing where that money comes from in the first place. And we had a limitation on revenue in Oregon, property tax revenue in 1990 called Measure 5, which has saved something like, property taxpayers something like a little over $40 billion since 1990. And his comment on the floor of the House in early July was that if it hadn't been for that reduction or a restraint on revenue in 1990, we would be driving in Oregon on platinum streets, quote unquote, platinum streets. Well, I did a quick calculation because I roughly know the price of platinum, and I know he was trying to be a little melodramatic, but I called him on it because platinum costs something in terms of paving our streets, something like 300,000 times more than asphalt. I doubt that saving some money in property taxes would let us drive on platinum streets. Just as the previous panel was talking about, windmills aren't something you want to build just because supposedly they're more environmental friendly than oil and gas. They're not economical sources of power. Platinum is not an economical material to drive on. So I think part of it is educating lawmakers, and I think people in this room probably know better than many of your colleagues back home, what real economic development is. It's not driven by the legislature, it's driven by the private sector. So I would look for ways that you can get your governments out of things it shouldn't be doing.
When I first was elected to the legislature in 1979, we had a tie in the Washington State Legislature, and that was before the era of computers. And I was an old CPA, so I was adding up how much money we spent. I was on the budget committee, and we got near ready to vote on the budget. I went up to the chair of the co-chair of the committee, and I said, we're spending $480 million more than the revenue forecast. He said, thanks for bringing that to my attention. I'll bring that up on the floor today. So he's up on the floor and he says, Mr. Speaker, it's been brought to my attention that the revenue forecast has gone up by $500 million. So we changed the law in Washington State in 1982 to come up with a nonpartisan revenue forecast council. If you don't have that, I strongly recommend that because we haven't had problems since. And again, we have a good forecaster in Washington State, either private or public. And then we have one person from each of the caucuses, one Republican, one Democrat from the House, one Republican, Democrat from the Senate, the state budget director and the state revenue director, who sit as a council and approve that in a public session, approve the revenue forecast. Now I would add to that then, the next key is to put 2% into reserve till it builds up to whatever you want, 5 or 7%. And once it gets up that high, then it's a tax cut for the rest. And to take money out of that, you need a 2/3 vote. And that sets the parameters.
Thanks. And actually, maybe I need to put more of an edge on my question, wake everyone up. I appreciate the comment you made on process, but I think one of the challenges you face with that is, people come and go, and there's an element there where you've got to rely on the integrity or the intent of the legislator or the group that you're speaking of. So I'm going to ask this more in a rhetorical sense and consider it. Why wouldn't it not make sense, though, to cap the growth of spending? And I'll just give you, this is sort of an old rule of thumb, which is the change in inflation, whether you use the GDP deflator or the CPI plus population, although maybe in Arizona we'd have to say legal population, but if the population increased 2% and that was what inflation was, I guess, from my standpoint, 4% ought to be enough, and any revenue increase that's beyond that should be returned to taxpayers. Why wouldn't you favor that? And then the battle becomes who gets up to that 4%. I think 4% maybe is overly generous in terms of you're trying to reduce the size of government. But if you had applied that standard when Ronald Reagan was elected president, when he was elected because government was too big, he was pretty clear about that. And the federal government had only grown with those two elements. We wouldn't be where we are. When you look at compounded numbers, it's really when you grow 4, 5, 6, 7% year after year, you get to a huge baseline. And I guess my question, maybe I didn't have enough edge on it, but why wouldn't we want to put some sort of cap? And maybe if you had an emergency or you had 2/3 or 3/5 vote, and so people understand going in, this is the limit, and we can argue about whether the state police gets more money or somebody else, but it isn't going to work that way where everyone elbows their way in and gets their 4 to 7% increase. So what's wrong with that idea?
Okay, I'm going to say two things, three things really. I don't disagree with you when you say process sometimes hinges on who the leader is. I mean, I agree with that because I've been there long enough to see different approaches and different processes change. But you still have the same structural process in place, the same structure for the processes in place. So you can have it, and certainly different leadership styles and different budgeting styles will take over. But let me give you two other aspects with regard to revenue cap, where you say, okay, we're going to have some kind of formula-driven cap. My problem with that is, number one, that implies that just because there's been some growth, that states should concomitantly grow their spending level to match this kind of revenue level. And I don't think that's the case. What that does is that locks in permanently an idea of increasing government, regardless of how much revenue you get in. And my point would be, look, if we have growth here at 4%, maybe we should be taking a closer look at whether we need to continue to grow government at that rate. Whereas when you say we're going to lock in a cap, I think that you're also at the same time kind of inferring an increase in spending that, in my point of view, I don't think is appropriate. And then the second point to make on that is, one of the reasons that you have elected officials is to be representative of people. And if you have just a formulaic driven, whether you're growing or reducing by some formulas, why even have an elected body then? Why elect people to think and respond to constituents in a free society? And those would be my three comments on that.
I like the idea of a supermajority to grow above a certain limit. I would turn it around, and I know in most of our states this probably isn't possible right now, but as the point I made earlier, if I were king, of course then we wouldn't need the legislature, but if we started out with an automatic reduction every year of maybe not even 4%, but 1%, unless it's overridden by a 2/3 majority or a 60% or whatever it is, to me that sets a better tone that we're assuming that whatever your government is spending today is somehow the right amount, except that it's not enough for education, because we never spend enough on education, even though I think most of us know that money doesn't equate to better education. But the public probably doesn't know that. So if you say that we're spending the right amount now, you've almost lost the battle. I argue that we're spending too much now. For example, in Oregon, roughly, we're spending as much on quote-unquote economic development, which isn't a proper function of government, as we are public safety, state police, and courts, which is the proper function of government. We're spending, I think it's something like 6% of our all funds budget in the one really core function of government. What's the other 94%? Well, there's all kinds of things, obviously, but we should be looking at reducing that other stuff. How you do it, I mean, I've been an advocate, if a Tabor amendment, population and plus inflation, were on the table today and that was the only alternative, I'd support it. Because we're so far from that right now in most of our states that would probably be an improvement. But I think you have a better chance tactically of getting that if you start out by saying, let's look at reducing the size of government, see who the objectors are, and then find the people who agree with you that certain things like the lottery, liquor sales, economic development, quote unquote, shouldn't be in the budget in the first place, and start trying to find ways to reduce the size of your government.
Fred, I co-sponsored one of the original spending limits in Washington State in 1979, issue 62, and then there were some games played, so then I worked on issue 601. And what I found out looking around the country, whether it's Colorado's Tabor initiative, Washington's, there's always a way to game the system. One of the things some of the governors did is take items out of the general fund and put it in other funds, so therefore it didn't count in the funds. The left is very good at then running counter initiatives, like in Colorado, that mandating so much money has to go into education a year, which they did in Florida and in Colorado. And so the best thing I think is if you go to outcome-based budgeting, it becomes real. And in Washington State, when they had outcome-based budgeting, and they knew they weren't going to be able to have the votes for tax increase, it suddenly had K-12 and higher ed really looking at each other, and unfortunately higher ed fell for it. K-12 said, if you give us $200 million of your money, we'll provide a better educated kid to college. So they gave them the $200 million, but they didn't get the results.
Thanks. And just for the record, I certainly wasn't advocating a 4% increase in spending. I'm not in favor of that. I'm licking my wounds a little. I mean, Idaho the last couple of years has been over that. And I think, to your point, Steve, I think the notion is that you've got to start somewhere. I mean, I like the idea of a 1% reduction as a starting point. I'm not sure that that's realistic, but the only reason, I'm not saying all of it, I wasn't suggesting be formula driven, but if you have a mechanism to limit the spending, then it's a different argument, because even in a state like Idaho, for example, where we're 80% Republican, you hear the same arguments, the same rationale. At the end of the day, spending goes to the last couple of sessions up 6 or 7%. So that makes 4 look good, even though maybe 4 looks bad if you're expecting a 1% cut. But I will move on. But I think those are some good points. I would like to one more question that I have, and then I'd like to open it up to the audience, because I think this is an important one. We talked about, you mentioned the outcome-based budgeting, and that can be challenging. I think one area, though, that you can really throw a spear at, because it's very clear what we have isn't going to work, and that is the pension system, particularly where you have folks collecting pensions in their 50s and living to 80 or 90. So the question is, how can legislators get public employees to join them? I think typically that's very hard. If you look at the Wisconsin experience, that was a fight. So how do you turn the tables, make it a positive outcome? And Senator, you'd mentioned that the fire unions had come to you, and maybe that in part was because they see the desperation. But what would be some ways that we could get public sector unions to either go for a 401k or a cash balance, some defined contribution system that reduced pension liability that states and municipalities have?
Well, I'll just speak to the Arizona experience. 3 years ago, we passed a legislation that had far-reaching impacts. We have several retirement systems in the state. We eliminated one of them completely by folding it into another, and any new people coming in would not get any more. Well, we were sued, as you might guess, is going to happen on any of that. And the Supreme Court, all members who are participants in the retirement system, ruled on the case. And it was brought by a retired judge, as a matter of fact, who knew everybody sitting on the bench. And so we lost that case. And it wasn't based entirely, to be honest with you, on Arizona law. They based it on the federal contracts provision of the U.S. Constitution. So this becomes a real impediment for us. So what we've done is we actually reached out to the unions, and we showed them data that we had. It is still really tough, as you know, because I brought in the head of, in Arizona, you can't have a union per se. They're associations. They come and sit down. So we have all the police association leaders come and sit in. 5 of them acknowledged that their pension system was about ready to be flushed down the toilet. And one guy said, hey, but I don't believe that data. And so what we've done is we have brought in outside actuaries to look at the data and show them so they can see that it isn't just us who are radical right-wingers or Republicans or whatever they think we may be. We've shown them data to convince them. Now what's happened is the proposals you'll see come out of us will be for defined, there'll be some kind of hybridization. I mean, that's what's going to have to happen. And when you hybridize these things, we can't touch anybody who's in the system today. Because it just takes one disgruntled person who says, well, my COLA is instead of going, by the way, we've given 29 straight years of COLA increases, including when the state revenue and the pension funds were reduced by 25% or more in a single year. We've given 4% COLA increases every year for 29 years. And just to get to this, if you came out of high school, became a fireman or firefighter, you only had to serve 20 years, and you could retire at age 41, full pension benefits, and it's the best part-time job around. But anyway, the point is, we have had to tailor whatever we're doing and work with the unions to get them to come along with us, and we're going along with them because they've been very cooperative. They've actually put out a plan that would it would still be on the same trajectory, it just wouldn't be as steep a slope before you fall off the edge of the world. But they're coming along, and we're having these negotiations, and they're working out well. But to get them involved, they had to have a sense of crisis of a municipality coming to asking their voters for new tax. 2 cities who've said we can't continue this. We actually have I think it's 1,500 police vacancies within Maricopa County, Arizona's largest county, because they cannot pay everything for all of their city and county services and still make pension contributions. So the cops and the firefighters have said, it's unsafe for us anymore. We've got to do something. And so this sense of urgency that they feel has been very compelling for them to come to us, and we're able to sit down and have some great discussions. And I think you will see something in Arizona unique that will go a long way to solving our problem with it, but by the end of this next session.
Oregon is pretty much seeing the same thing. We've had 2 attempts at major pension reform actually introduced by Democrats, because they control everything in the state of Oregon. And the Supreme Court has struck down most of those reforms twice now. And one leading private sector economist who the legislature listens to called this pension system, the defined benefit pension system we have and most of you have, a generational mistake. We're just going to have to live with it for a generation because you can't change it through the courts. And as far as I can see, our unions aren't hurting enough to come to the table to want to change it. So I'm not, again, I guess that's another reason why we're going to be paying more and more firefighters not to fight fires and policemen not to protect us from crime as they retire until we get through this generational mistake. And hopefully we learn from our mistakes so that we need going forward to have a defined contribution plan. Totally. I don't like the hybrid approach because, again, it will lead to, I think, the same kind of problem. So hopefully we can go forward with defined contribution, but there's almost nothing legally we can do to change what's going on for this next generation.
One of the things is, until about 3 years ago, my mistake was, as an old CPA, I kept talking in facts. Facts tell, but as the senator mentioned, we need stories. Right. Stories sell, and the left is really good at stories. They may not be true, but they're very emotional. They're very emotional. So what we've been doing is we've been working on pension reform in terms of stories. And 2 years ago, we started switching the mainstream media. You won't find virtually any of the major newspapers now that don't believe there is a serious crisis in pensions. And we're working now with state employees and teachers. And one of the things we're saying is the benefits you earn, you can keep. If there's ballooning and stuff like that, then that's a different story. In some states, you can stop the COLAs. It depends upon your state law, state judges, et cetera. But one of the things we urge to the state employees and the teachers is we're going to keep the promises. The benefits you earned, you're going to have. But we want to be fair to all. And the senator just mentioned, the firemen are worried about fires and everything else. And all of a sudden, when you talk to groups of state employees particularly, they are concerned about being fair to all. In Chicago, they're concerned right now, because they're really in trouble, about 300 teachers being laid off, and they say, wait a minute, And then the other thing that really excites them is to keep politicians out of the retirement system. And that's what the TIA craft does so well. But the games that politicians play, I hate to be so critical, but Chris Christie is the biggest gamer there is. You know, he keeps saying, okay, we're going to have pension reform. You're going to put more money into pensions. You're going to take a little bit less, and we're going to pay the ARC. Well, he hasn't paid the ARC in 4 years. I mean, we're talking about over $8 billion that they used to balance the budget over the last 4 years. And now they have to make that up in terms of that. So suddenly you get the state employees who are listening to you, and in many cases, they won't go for defined contributions, even though you explain it. They'll go for the hybrid. They'll understand the hybrid, particularly for the new employees. And that's the key thing is to get the message out in terms of story form. Now, the way to really make the selling point is start talking about what happened to people. What happened to people in Pritchard, Alabama? Pritchard, Alabama is going bankrupt. Right. The judge says, pay the pensions first and then take care of everything else. The city said, no, we don't have enough money to do that. We're not going to pay the pensioners. And they didn't. For a year and a half, they got nothing in their pensions. Go to Washington Park, Illinois, where they had their pensions cut, about 75%. Go to Detroit, where they thought they were solved, but the federal judge came in and said, hey, you know that alternative program you had that you were earning all that money? You got to pay that back. And you got to pay it back by September 1st of this year, or we're going to charge interest on that. Some of these people have to pay back $100,000. You talk about a rude awakening. So if you get those stories out there, all of a sudden you're going to have more people interested in it.
Right. Questions from the audience?
They're worn out.
Thank you very much. I'm Senator Barbara Bailey from Washington State. I've served on the pension committee ever since I've been in the legislature for 13 years. One of the most challenging committees I've had the opportunity to work on. And I keep volunteering every year to do it. But the one thing that I wanted to ask you is a little different, 2 questions. We have tried to convert to defined contributions, and we actually have a hybrid situation right now. And one of the things that we continue to have problems with is that everyone wants to retire early and draw all of their pension. So I appreciate some of your discussion in that regard. If there are any solutions out there, I'd like to know what they are, especially when people say they can no longer physically do their job because of where they are working, so they want an early retirement. And we're facing that probably again this year by our unions. The second one I want to ask you about is in regards to people who have committed serious felony crimes in the course of their employment. We have in our state several people who are in our pension system drawing a pension who have done that, and there's a lot of public pressure to do something about them drawing a pension while they're in prison. So I'd like to see if anybody has any information on something about that.
I don't on the second one. It depends upon a court case. I mean, you can take away their pensions, you'll go be in court. The first one, I'd talk to Rhode Island and see how their pension system is working now. They came up with kind of a hybrid system. And from what I hear, everybody seems to be pretty happy up there. It was the state treasurer who pushed it, but she campaigned around the state. Now she's the governor of Rhode Island, Gina Raimondo.
Well, yeah, I think the hybrid system is good, but I mean, it sounds to me like you're talking almost like disability almost, if people are retiring early due to some kind of disability, and that's where I would aim some of my reform at is disability as opposed to just straight pension. But the other one, this is just a kind of a wacky idea just off the top of my head because I never heard of that problem before, but one of the things that I would probably do is I would say, well, is there a way, let's find out what those crimes are. In Arizona, we get restitution to victims, so we'd want to make sure the victims are all receiving restitutions from that pension. The other thing is sometimes we are able to impose incarceration costs. And I would go that way and then maybe restore that to the retirement fund. Anyway, it's good to know someone else is thinking like me. So that doesn't happen often. Sorry about that for you. Oh, they didn't make it through. Sorry.
I'm going to take a little prerogative. This is probably going to be the last question because if nothing else, we try to stay on time at the Heartland Institute. So I'm going to try to get everyone out here. But for Bob Williams, obviously we're here in Seattle. And I know there's been a big push over the last couple of years by, quite frankly, left-funded groups to increase the minimum wage. And here they had, I guess, in the SeaTac district raised it to $15 an hour. What has been the impact of there? Have we seen, what has been the experience with that?
Well, the little city of SeaTac, which is right around the airport, they enacted through legislation minimum wage $15 an hour for hospitality industry and airport workers only, not for city employees, not for anybody else. Alaska Airlines was very successful in suing to say, we're not in the city, we're on port land, it's the port of SeaTac, so it didn't apply to them. The hospitality industry's been hit up pretty hard. The first thing they found out is when they went to $15 an hour, some of them lost their jobs. The second thing is they lost their free parking, they lost their health care, and they lost their vacations. And now, in some of the places like Seattle has started this minimum wage, you get a surcharge on your bill if you go to a restaurant for that. The car rental companies who are off the Seattle property are looking at moving outside of the city limits of SeaTac. So there's an effect. I mean, you can't just raise wages and think there's no effect.
Wow.
Okay, well, I want to thank our panel. Thanks, Fred, for moderating. I didn't want to